Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2. Hello, everyone. Oh, I like that. Hello, everyone. Okay. Can I please ask that everyone, can you please move forward? Please come all the way to the front. I'm thinking of what to say to make you come all the way. I have an idea. I don't want to make promises that won't be fulfilled, but I can assure you that the most important points will be said without a microphone. So if you're anything beyond 3 seats to the stage, you won't catch the most important points. And trust me, they're pretty important. Okay, guess what? If there's anyone who is behind the cameras, then we'll take it you're not with us. Oh, she's charging her phone. Okay. And I'll just randomly pick anyone who's behind the cameras just to come and sit here on this special seat. We'll designate this the naughty seat. All right. Welcome, everyone. And I'm sure that does everyone have a copy of this? If you don't, there are a few copies right there, and you can grab one. This is the most important document in the next 1 hour, so it's important you have one. We're talking about the launch of the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index for 2019, and I see some of us are already on page 3. Some of us are reading page 3 already. That's fine, but for those who haven't, 24 of the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecoms companies have been featured in this report, and it's focused on their disclosed commitments and policies affecting, obviously, freedom of expression and privacy. And today I have with me an amazing panel, and I'll introduce them. We'll start with a presentation by Rebecca MacKinnon, who's Director, Ranking Digital Rights, and after that we'll have the 2 respondents I have with me today. Afef Abrougui is Corporate Accountability Editor for Ranking Digital Rights Advox, and Advox Editor for the Middle East and North Africa for Global Voices. And Shmyla is the Project Manager for the Cyber Harassment Helpline at the Digital Rights Foundation in Pakistan. And we have more than 2 respondents, actually. If you have a copy of this document, you'll see that your name is there on number 3. And the 3rd respondent is everyone else in the room. And of course, as we progress, because this is being streamed live, so we have a virtual audience with us. So when we get to the part where we're having a conversation around the report, we'll also go to Twitter and get some comments from those who are there. But I trust that the experts in the room, I mean, I look around the room already, and I see experts who can speak to this topic. So I won't waste any time. We've got just, I was going to say 60 minutes, but it's now 56 minutes. But I'm just going to go right away and invite Rebecca to introduce the report, tell us a bit. I mean, open this black box and let's see what's inside it.
We're really honored to have such an articulate and moderator who's really experiencing these issues on the ground in your own organization, and and the rest of and Afef and Shmyla too. So, ranking digital rights. Why are we doing this? Why are we evaluating companies on their disclosed policies and practices affecting users' freedom of expression and privacy? It's because we share a vision that I think everybody here shares, or you wouldn't be here. We believe that the internet needs to support and sustain human rights. And we believe that companies must do their part, because if companies are not doing everything possible to build and design and operate an internet that supports and sustains human rights, how are we going to have a free and open global internet? how are we going to have internet freedom? So that's the point. And so because we don't have unlimited resources, we're covering 24 companies. You know, we couldn't cover all the companies in the world that have any impact on the internet. So for this year's index, we have 24 companies that we're evaluating that when you add them together are touching the digital lives of the majority of internet users on the planet. And one of the things we'll talk about a little bit more is that our methodology is open, and so all of you are welcome to apply the same questions to other similar companies that we're not covering. So you can kind of think about that as we're talking. And so let me just see if this is working. So this is the overarching kind of index, and there's an image of it on this 4-page summary that is stacked around the room in a few different places, so you can get a copy of it. And this is really just a distillation of a much longer report with company report cards that are all available on the website and analysis of the results according to all the indicators. And you can also go through interactive data for every single question we evaluated the companies on, and you can even download the raw data and look at how we scored every single component if you're interested in dissecting that and perhaps duplicating it or evaluating other companies. So what did we evaluate? So we had 35 different questions, and I'm obviously not going to go through every single of those questions and the results today, but they're divided up into 3 different categories. And you see the total scores on the left-hand side, and you'll be able to see them better on the piece of paper. And then we evaluated companies. The first category of questions that we looked at relate to what we call governance. So do companies have a commitment to respect freedom of expression and privacy of their users? Is there board oversight over the risks to users related to freedom of expression and privacy? Are companies conducting due diligence? Are there human rights impact assessments related to how companies are affecting freedom of expression and privacy? Are there grievance and remedy mechanisms? Is there stakeholder engagement, and so on? That's what we're looking at in the governance category. In the freedom of expression category, we're not looking at which platform is a complete free-for-all. Freedom of expression, according to human rights, there can be limitations. You do not have the right to use a platform to organize a massacre of your neighboring village. But when there are restrictions on freedom of expression, they need to be necessary and proportionate. There needs to be, you are all familiar with the human rights standards around under what circumstances that is appropriate. So what we're really looking for in the freedom of expression category is, are companies being transparent and accountable about all the ways in which your expression is being restricted through their platforms or services? Are they being clear with you what types of government demands they're getting and how they're responding to them, and how they do due diligence about government demands or other demands? If they're getting demands for copyright takedowns or right to be forgotten, how much transparency is there about the ways in which a person's speech can be restricted? Is there transparency about network shutdowns? We'll talk a bit more about that. And similarly with the privacy indicators, we're looking for companies to be clear with users about all the ways in which your information about you is known and used and accessed by whom, under what authority. So we're looking for transparency about what's known as data protection related issues. So what's being collected, with whom it's being shared, under what circumstances, how it's being used, are people being given control over how they use their data, et cetera. Then we also want transparency about how companies are handling government demands, and basic disclosure about, are you deploying basic security practices that are industry standard, and do you provide evidence that you're doing so? So that's kind of the 35 questions basically add up to what extent are companies clear and accountable about all the ways that your speech could be restricted or all the ways that others may know things about you and be able to use that information. So this year's index, the two leading companies in the internet and mobile ecosystem, Microsoft overall was both disclosing more about its policies and practices, and again, the high score is 62. So academically, you know, if you're doing an exam, that's not exactly an A, but nonetheless, you know, we're seeing improvement. This is a little bit more closer up just of the overarching score, and you'll see I've sort of put some bands in here that give you a sense of how things break down, and you can go into the website and look at the material in terms of how and why this breakdown occurred. We did have two new companies in the index. This is our fourth index. We had 22 companies last year. We have 24 this year. The two new companies were Telenor and Deutsche Telekom, and they did pretty well, you know, especially for companies that are in the index for the first time, and we'll talk a bit more about that. This is a graph showing the extent to which companies improved. So between last year and this year, 19 out of the 22 that were evaluated last year improved. And you'll see that Telefonica, the Spanish-based telecommunications company that operates all around Latin America in particular, they improved the most. So that was very interesting. And so you can kind of see the extent to which companies improved. And very interestingly, the two Chinese companies in the index made quite a number of improvements around their disclosures about what they do with users' data. They didn't disclose anything about anything related to government demands. I think if you know anything about China, you know why. But they have been making some efforts, actually, to disclose things that the government doesn't prevent them from disclosing. So that's very, very interesting. And Yandex also was sort of responding to, particularly around governance and disclosing more things. So that was very interesting. This is I'm going to focus several slides on governance results, because overall, if the company is not making commitments, and if the highest level of the company is not really overseeing what are the risks to users, privacy and expression across the entire business, you know, a lot of the details become harder to manage. So in governance, what's quite interesting, we have Judith Lichtenberg from the Global Network Initiative here. The GNI member companies did score highest on governance, although they were not uniform. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the differences in a minute. But this is because GNI member companies, while none of them being perfect, do make some basic commitments about due diligence, about oversight in relation to users' freedom of expression and privacy, primarily around government demands. But nonetheless, they're at least doing this due diligence and making these commitments. So they tend to score higher. I'll sort of note that there's a couple companies here, Twitter and Apple, that do a lot of PR about their respect for human rights, but on governance, when it comes down to what are they actually doing with governance and disclosing, they're much farther behind. The indicator on human rights impact assessments, specifically, do companies show any evidence that they do human rights impact assessments, and how comprehensive are they? And you can go into the methodology and see exactly what we're asking. Again, I was mentioning Apple and Twitter. I'll single them out again for showing very little evidence of any kind of human rights impact assessment. Oops, I'm sorry, go back there. You see that the GNI companies, when it comes to comprehensiveness of impact assessments, there's a great deal of variation. And digging down a little bit into that particular indicator, because there are sub-questions, we asked this year both in terms of, whoops, that slide, I need to fix that next time, terms of service, are they conducting due diligence around terms of service enforcement? And there were only 3 companies in the index that showed any evidence of doing human rights due diligence around terms of service enforcement. When it comes to due diligence around artificial intelligence algorithms and so on, again, only 3 companies showed any evidence of that type of due diligence. And you can, I think, note who is not there and think about that and maybe ask them about it. Targeted advertising business models, human rights impact assessments around their business models. Nobody provides any evidence of that. That's something to push on in our advocacy. Another interesting thing is that we found that governance of privacy risks was much stronger than governance of freedom of expression risks. And so you'll see the darker green is privacy, the lighter green is freedom of expression for each of the governance indicators that we covered. This chart shows the gap, which companies had the biggest gap between their governance of privacy risks and their governance of freedom of expression risks. And Apple had the biggest gap. It demonstrated a certain amount of governance over privacy risks, virtually no governance over freedom of expression impacts. So you can ask them about that. And then it kind of goes from there. Now, given that companies are under extreme pressure from governments around the world, and with the Christchurch call just coming out this week, and a lot of other legislation or threatened legislation about requiring companies to control speech that arguably is not real great, but how do you do it in a manner that doesn't affect freedom of expression? The fact that governance and due diligence around freedom of expression is much weaker across the industry than privacy is a huge concern. And that's an area to really push. Now, in our freedom of expression category, again, we're looking at to what extent are companies being transparent about the ways in which people's content might be restricted or access to the internet might be restricted, both in terms of external demands and their own rules and how they enforce them. And so that's kind of how it plays out overall. In the set of indicators that's looking at transparency around external demands to restrict content, you'll see that the level of transparency about external parties, whether it's governments making demands for freedom of expression, or whether it's copyright takedowns or right to be forgotten or defamation or whatever, we need a lot. We need to see much better. And part of the obstacle, unfortunately, in many places, is governments not allowing companies to be transparent. So that's another issue we can talk about. Interestingly, when you hear certain people say, oh, this is just a Western issue, non-Western people don't care about freedom of expression and human rights, that is not true. And Kakao in particular, a Korean mobile messaging and social media company that also has a search engine, they performed quite strongly in quite a lot of indicators. So they are an example of when you have the right conditions, everybody cares. And their users certainly care. Another indicator is looking for transparency reporting about terms of service enforcement. What are you taking down when you're enforcing terms of service? The first year we had the index and we asked that question, nobody had any disclosure or transparency reporting at all. And it's improved over time. And so now we've got 4 companies to varying degrees releasing information about at least one of their services, even if not all of their services. So we're seeing progress on that, thanks to a lot of people's pushing. When it comes to network shutdowns and company transparency about the circumstances under which governments might demand network shutdowns, this is a comparison sort of between 2018 and 2019, who made improvements in the past year and who basically stayed the same. So this will give you a sense of, at the moment, Telefonica and Telenor are disclosing a lot more information about what types of demands they're getting from what governments, what number of demands, and so on. This is, again, a tough indicator because a lot of governments have laws that prevent companies from disclosing key information about shutdown demands. Of course, shutdown demands shouldn't happen at all, but we need companies at least to be able to communicate to users why they're happening. And that's a really tough one. Privacy and security really quickly, and then I want to get to the conversation. So our entire basket of 18 indicators looking at privacy, looking at companies, to what extent are they communicating publicly about their policies and practices that affect what is collected, with whom it's shared, who has access, how secure is it. We've got Deutsche Telekom, which is a new addition to the index this year, in first place. And then it goes from there. And again, there are some companies that come to us and say, well, we're actually doing all this great stuff, and we tell the regulators about it. I'm like, why don't you tell your users? And I don't know, users need to and the reason why this is important for users to know and for the public to know is that if people do not understand who might have access to their data under what circumstances and how their data is going to be used, they can't make informed choices about how to use these platforms. And you can't expect them to be telecoms lawyers and sort of understand, oh, well, if you're in compliance with legal requirements, then this is what it means for me personally, you know. So that's why we're looking at transparency. And another thing to note about this is, and I'm almost done with the presentation, we can get into the conversation. These are the indicators, the 6 different indicators that look at the collection, use, sharing, control over personal access to your personal data. And these are the indicators. They're not a direct map with GDPR, but there's a relationship between these indicators and GDPR. In a lot of cases, we're scoring much more tough than GDPR because we're looking for disclosure to the public, not just to regulators. And the GDPR actually, in some cases, isn't, or is it not, it's not being interpreted as requiring disclosure to users as much. But interestingly, while we've seen improvements on all of those indicators, it's not as big a spike as one would expect. So there's an interesting discussion in our report about the extent to which companies that did best in our privacy indicators are going much further than just legal compliance. They're going much further than just saying, okay, this is what the law requires and we won't get sued if we do these minimal things. That they're really thinking more about, okay, what do we need to do to demonstrate respect for users' rights and to have our users understand what's going on. So that, again, is an interesting thing to think about in our advocacy. And this indicator is, we've got kind of 2 European companies that I've highlighted here as an example of how just because we have the GDPR doesn't mean everybody's doing the same thing, at least in terms of what's disclosed to the public and to users. And another thing about this indicator, we also call this our Cambridge Analytica indicator, because it kind of indicates to what extent people have control over the extent to which their data is used and shared. And Facebook, among internet and mobile companies last year, basically came in last place. There were some telcos that were further behind, but for internet and mobile ecosystem companies, Facebook was last. They're now ahead of Baidu and Mail.ru. So they have made changes, but when our researchers kind of went and looked at, qualitatively what actually changed, it wasn't as much as some of the rhetoric might indicate. So recommendations for companies, In the report, we have a lot more detail. Even in this, we have a lot more detail. But obviously, governance, oversight, and due diligence is absolutely key. And this is something to really push on. Grievance and remedy mechanisms. I didn't have time to get into that so much, but grievance and remedy mechanisms, ways for people to lodge complaints with the company that their rights have been violated, and to get redress. In most cases, companies are not doing well, with a couple of exceptions. Again, we need transparency. About people need to understand how their information environment is being shaped, both by the companies and through the companies by others. That's essential if we're actually going to have democracy. Go beyond legal compliance. As I mentioned earlier, the companies that are doing best in the index are doing more than just saying, we adhere to the law and we're not violating the law. If you're really going to be respecting and protecting human rights, you need to, I'm afraid, go much further than the law. And innovate. And there's a number of companies that are starting to experiment and try different things to address some of the problems, and we should encourage that. There's some companies that are starting to talk to stakeholders and figure out, okay, how do we address some of these hard problems? We should certainly welcome more of those types of conversations. We also have a lot more recommendations this year for governments than in the past. We have a real problem with laws not being compatible with human rights standards, obviously, and that makes it harder for companies to respect human rights. Governments must commit to robust oversight of themselves as well as of companies. Governments must be transparent about what they're demanding of companies. When the takedown requests or shutdown requests or censorship requests, they should be issuing transparency reports, and they should change laws that are preventing companies from being transparent about these things. Strong corporate governance. Let's get away from these intermediary liability things that are imposing fines if you don't take content down in 24 hours, and let's move towards requiring companies to demonstrate that they're doing due diligence, that they have grievance and remedy, that there's board-level oversight over these issues. That will, I think, get us farther in the long run. Access to remedy. Again, people do not have access to remedy in most circumstances, and that's a huge problem. So that's it. I've gone longer than I had intended, so I apologize to the panel, but now we'll have a conversation.
Thank you very much. We've seen a lot from what you've said, and even for the things that you haven't said. I see you didn't have recommendations for civil society, but I'm sure it's written somewhere there. Recommendation for civil society: use these numbers. We see it. We see those numbers. All right. Let me quickly, and I'm sure there are people who have questions and who have comments. And one of the things that we know for a fact is that in this room we've got lived experience from people who either have engaged at these companies as corporations or use some of these services. So we will come to you for some of your input on this. But let me go to Afef. Afef, you wear many hats, but I'm going to ask you to put two on now: the ranking digital rights and the global voices art, and respond to this. What have you seen over the last few years in terms of the progress? One key question I'd like you to respond to is: do you think that companies are in a way reacting to the pressure that this report and some other reports have literally, when the light shines on them and their logo pops up in the negative region, do you think people are taking notice of that? And what other things have you seen in the regions where you work in terms of this report?
Certainly, companies in certain regions, or at least like in countries where there are like some democratic institutions, where the human rights protections are stronger, are definitely more willing to engage. But also we've seen like some changes, like from Baidu and Tencent. I think at least Baidu, like they made some changes in their privacy category, not in all areas, obviously, because of the regulations. We've seen Yandex engage more this year, which is an internet company based in Russia. They made some changes, at least, in some of the areas where they can, somehow make changes. But of course, there are like other areas where they can make changes. And so yeah, and the thing is, for instance, like when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa region, and the index includes 2 companies here, the UAE-based Etisalat and the Qatari or the Qatar-based Ooredoo, and these actually come at the bottom of the ranking. And they were also, at the bottom of the ranking, I think, in the previous 2 indexes. But I think with this year index, actually, they lost some few points. I mean, they don't have much points to lose anyway, which is very, which is like a bit, I mean, at the same time, for those, who sort of, are familiar with the region and also with the repressive, environments for human rights online and internet freedom where these 2 companies operate, it's not a surprise, of course. I mean, the UAE and the Qatari governments, they greatly restrict freedom of expression online. They hold monopolies over the telecommunication markets. I mean, the 2 companies are also, these are also 2 companies that are owned by the states. They are not, and they are required by law to hand over user information and to restrict or block content when they are required. So of course, I mean, there are like these areas like we wouldn't expect much transparency, but at the same time, you look at Ooredoo, for instance, which is based in Qatar, and I think a couple of years ago, like recently, like Qatar, they adopted like a data protection law, and it has, of course, it's not, I mean, in terms of standard, like it's not, like it doesn't provide like maximum protection for users, but it has like some requirements for transparency, from companies to sort of at least do a minimum of like, informing users, which data they collect and, for what purposes. But Ooredoo doesn't even publish a privacy policy, like in Qatar. They don't even make the slightest effort of, informing users or like providing to them minimum information about what they do with their data. And there are like no legal barriers for them to do so. And the problem is, at the same time, I mean, also like concerning the region, is that these 2 companies are probably like the biggest companies like in the region. They have, they own shares in subsidiaries that operate in other regions, in other countries in the region. And also their practices in other countries, it's not different, because I think the index, we assess the policies of these companies in their whole markets. But these 2 companies, they operate in other markets where where the governments engage in, they order network shutdowns. They ban VoIP applications, they block content. You look at Egypt right now, where Etisalat operates. The censorship is growing, censorship of political content, of websites of independent media and human rights groups are being blocked. But at the same time, Etisalat, doesn't provide any information about these policies. And it's also not only, the regional companies. Also, we have the index includes Orange and Vodafone, and Orange and Vodafone also operates in the region. They have some operations in the region. And if you look at these 2 companies, of course, they make commitments to respect human rights in accordance with international standards. And they also reveal some information in their home markets, but when they operate in other countries where the sort of human rights protections are not that strong, they don't reveal much or at all. So, yeah.
That's it. Thank you. So let me come to you, Shmyla. Looking at this report, and not just comparing the previous years with this year now, I'd like you to kindly look into the crystal ball a bit. I mean, like we say, if you look at the last few years, you should be able to also maybe predict the future a bit. You give your reaction to the report that has been launched, but kind of, should we be very hopeful going into, say, 2020, for example? Are we going to see like some sudden spikes in certain regions, and are we going to be singing hooray?
So thank you so much for this excellent presentation. It really distilled like sort of the main indicators that we should be looking at. And for me, sort of this directly sort of obviously is a very useful tool for us to use and how to assess these companies and hold them accountable. But it also raises certain questions about like what kind of, where the accountability lies and who has access to that accountability. So with sort of located in South Asia, the main question for us becomes whether the mechanisms of accountability sort of are bifurcated according to where someone is situated. So where we see like sort of a lot of tech companies being held accountable either in their home countries or even in like sort of places like Europe, the same sort of standards are not being applied to these companies when they're especially moving towards the global south. And that becomes really interesting because the reason that a lot of these companies are complying to these standards is obviously because there's more pressure in the sort of global north. That's where a lot of these conversations are taking place, but also there's a lot of privilege sort of where when sort of a civil society organization placed in a particular sort of maybe in Washington says something that has more of an impact than an organization in Lahore, for example. Like I don't think that would register in the sort of radar of these big tech companies. And what, to a certain extent, my concern then becomes is that there are two sort of systems of accountability where there are higher standards applied in certain countries and then lower standards in certain countries, especially like as Afef was also pointing out, like countries that don't have stronger data protection laws. These companies have less of an incentive to then apply these governance models to themselves in those companies because there's no, in those countries because there's no legal obligation to do so. And this becomes, so if we were to sort of, this is not like the same crystal ball that you were talking about, but maybe to sort of speculate that we know that in terms of transparency, even though we've seen increases in sort of sort of disclosures regarding privacy in certain countries, in like countries like Pakistan or like I would say India, there's not been the same level of disclosure even with telecom companies like Telenor was was also assessed in this report. If you could see clearly the kind of the difference in terms of the disclosures that are happening, and that also holds especially for issues of freedom of expression. So our experience echoes the sort of experience of the report that reports sort of more globally, and we've seen that sort of the proximity of these tech companies with governments is quite high, and we don't exactly sort of know the nature of that proximity and how, so while companies are disclosing how many requests were put in, we have no idea sort of what those requests look like, what is the compliance rate in a lot of cases. And so recently, for example, like we started to see that a lot of journalists and activists started to receive messages from Twitter where they were told that there has been official correspondence regarding certain tweets and that they have deemed the content that they were posting to be against Pakistani law, but not against the community standards that Twitter has. So it was a really interesting sort of issue in Pakistan because when we sort of asked the government, like, which Pakistani law are you applying to? Are you applying, like, what was the reasoning behind it? They flatly denied, like, any sort of official correspondence with Twitter. And when we asked Twitter, where was this correspondence coming from? Can you please tell us at least the ministry that was communicating with you? There was complete silence on their part. And what standards were used to assess whether something violated Pakistani law was also sort of, are you relying relying on existing local jurisprudence? Are you making your own assessment? Like, so these things were are completely sort of hidden from view, and have really we've started to see that there has been this sort of social media companies are slowly, in terms of regulation, becoming sort of arms of the state to a certain extent as well. But so looking sort of answering your question regarding like sort of the future, my fear is that sort of in terms of freedom of expression, there is, as local laws become more sort of restrictive, the companies might start to defer to those local laws. And so while on the surface they can say we are complying, we are even transparent, but the results that we could see might not be as encouraging. But at the same time, in terms of trends, we've seen that like social media companies, like recently Facebook took down a lot of content related to sort of pages being run by allegedly the Pakistan military, which was quite interesting because that's something that we haven't seen before. So there is pressure growing even from like sort of spaces that you wouldn't imagine, where like sort of these voices are coming from, sort of. So, civil society is trying to sort of, like for example, we've also used this model to apply to telecom companies locally in Pakistan, and we've seen like some companies at least putting up basic information like how much, what data do they hold, which we probably doesn't tell you much. It doesn't tell you what they do with the data, and sort of, but at least is a step in the right direction. And I think the next step, I think, in terms of maybe this report can also take is to sort of maybe move towards looking towards a more granular sort of approach, and like where are these standards being uniformly applied everywhere? Because we don't want like a second-class sort of section of citizens emerging in the global community as well.
Different rules applying somewhere, and different rules applying in another location of the world. Thank you very much. So let me come to the experts in the room. You've got experience regarding the issues we talked about in this report, and this is the part where I look around the room, and I'm sure, okay, I see Femi already. Do we have mics?
Yeah, I just realized we didn't have a mic runner. So
Okay, it's fine, it's fine. I need to get my 20,000 steps anyway. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Femi, okay. So, all right. I'd love to have, thank you. I was going to ask for people on the other end so I can walk a lot. All right, Femi, let's have you.
Thank you so much for the report. I think when you went into the presentations, it gave a bit more context. However, my eyes were still drawn to the summary here. And it strikes me, and I get the feeling that the way the ranking here is presented may give the impression that certain companies are doing great, when we know from practice in different parts of the world that they may not be as great as they are, right? So when you say, when I see Facebook and I see Google and I see all these guys higher up on the ranking, how do we prevent them from using this as justification to say, well, we're not so bad? That's one. And then the second side too, which I'm looking at it with my African hat on, and it strikes me that the top companies here are either American or they're Western. And chances are that when you speak to people in certain places, they'll say, well, you've applied Western values in coming up with your ranking, which is why we score low, because what you say as is privacy and all this may not actually fit the context of the values of our country. How do we work against that kind of categorization?
You can go ahead, yes. The mic, not your book. Thank you.
Those are really key questions, and since my brain at this point can only keep one question at a time, I'll answer it right away. In terms of this concern that companies will, claim they're doing great. I mean, the highest score is 62. So again, that's not a high grade, right? So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that, it's not kind of an A. The people at the top are not getting A's. They're not even getting B's. That they're showing serious gaps. And so I think that's kind of the way to look at it from an advocacy standpoint. And also, all of these companies, even the ones that overall their highest average score is further to the top, as you'll see from the Facebook example. Not to pick on our Facebook friends here, but maybe they're relatively better than some Chinese companies and some others on overall. But on specific questions that they really have no excuse, they could be, they're really not doing well. And for a lot of the companies, you see those types of things happening, kind of low scores for specific indicators. And so from an advocacy standpoint, I think the key thing is to really seize upon the specific questions that are really important to you, that specific countries are doing, specific companies are doing poorly on, and emphasize that, And so don't let companies get away with saying, oh, we did great, because 61, 58, that's not a good grade. So I think in part it's up to all of us to make sure that people don't misinterpret this or kind of use it for undeserved PR value. On the other hand, there are some areas where some companies are doing much better than others, and so that's worth rewarding. In terms of the Western versus Global South and so on, I mean, that's a challenge. Because we couldn't do everything, we picked a selection of companies that touch the digital lives of most people on the planet. And with our selection of telcos, it's companies that have a broader footprint, in more places. So because it's a global snapshot, really. But what we really want to encourage people to do is, our methodology is all open online. Take it, adapt it, take out half the questions and add ones that you think are relevant to your country, that are most urgent and important for your country, and do your own ranking of the companies in your country and region. And that's what Afef, she did that for the Arab region with mobile operators. They didn't use all our questions. They just used, she and her colleagues just used a selection that they felt were most urgent and important for their region. So this was really meant to be a starting point to enable or to suggest how we might have a broader conversation with more companies, but collecting kind of facts and data. And one of the challenges, I think, with advocacy directed at companies a lot of the time is that you say, oh, you need to be, we don't like this that you're doing, we don't like that you're doing, and the companies say, well, what should we do differently? Or they might say, well, there's no other option, we have to do it this way. And so we're trying to provide data and examples of, no, actually, there's this other company that does it quite differently. And there's no law preventing you from doing this. So to help to provide facts and data for people to use. But it's really only the beginning. So I hope you'll take it upon yourself to create an index for your country and your region that you feel is most relevant.
Okay. All right. Afef, very quickly.
Add something regarding how we make the argument that these, privacy and freedom of expression also matter in, Africa and Middle East. I think one of the things, and I'm going to answer this as an editor. So I think one of the tools that we need to make more use of is storytelling. Like network shutdowns impact people. It impacts their daily lives. When, in Cameroon for months, in certain regions, they are left without the internet. It doesn't only impact, political activists, it also impacts people's access to education. It impacts their access to job opportunities, to other economic opportunities. So we need to make, to tell the stories of these people who are being impacted so that, to basically say, yeah, this is also matter, access to the internet matters. So.
I'll take all of the questions now, and then if we have time, we can go back. So I'll let him go, then I'll come to. Please go ahead, sir.
My name is Abel from Ethiopia, from private media. Digital right has two major enemies. One is the government, the second one is a corporate. In the past, we have been engaged in to regulate the government. There were many initiatives, but this kind of initiatives is a new thing for me. So having this kind of initiatives is very good. My question is related to, is there any way to put pressure on these companies throughout the year or releasing one report once a year? For example, last month, Ethiopian Prime Minister told to the public media there is a problem of hate speech and disinformation on Facebook, so that the government is consulting with Facebook, and Facebook has showed a kind of a positive sign to cooperate with the government. And after that, we have seen many prominent activists in Facebook has lost their accounts. So when this kind of incidents happen, there must be some kind of activity online to address this issue. Thank you.
We've got 2 comments and questions from here, and we've got 1, 2, 3, and I think that's about. Yes.
Thank you. This is work.
Yeah.
Just say a few things that you don't mean to say first.
What does 100 look like? And how can any one of these laggers get to 100? If you just walk us through this very briefly.
Okay. I'll come back to you in a second. The cheat sheet for this. All
okay.
Right.
So hello, everyone. Thank you to the Ranking Digital Rights team for another great report. I have a bit of a challenging, hopefully challenging question. We're increasingly talking about a fragmented internet. So basically, to separate internet development, including companies which are ranking quite, I mean, not that bad in the current version of the report, but companies which have different practices locally. And I'm not talking about telcos which have subsidiaries. I'm talking about internet companies like Google, for instance. We remember Dragonfly. So how does the index include that? I mean, can the index include that? That's my question.
Thank you, Julie. And I've got 3 gentlemen towards the back. Now, still 3. I said 20,000 people, not 40,000. Okay.
Thank you. I understand that this data becomes a very relevant advocacy tool for a lot of us in civil society. But also I'd like to ask that beyond the data, how do we, for instance, in the African context, particularly using the Ethiopian example, where government both has a monopoly over the telcos and also is under some form of constitutional obligation to open up in terms of being transparent about digital rights. In this kind of mix, and also I was just telling my friend that where the AU is headquartered, if you have this kind of mix where there's a political play, there's the need to open up about digital rights, and also government has the overall power in all these circumstances, how do we as civil society leverage on this report to engage such powers where there's a surveillance on citizens' use of digital websites and applications? And the second one is on about access to this information. How do we distribute this information? How many people will have, access to this information and this data across their countries, and how will they use it? Thanks.
You're the answer to the second question, but I'll let Arthur do that, and then the last question and comment. Just start talking, start singing, and then you start talking. See?
My name is Arthur Gwagwa, and I wear many hats, but currently I'm doing research on AI ethics for Research ICT Africa. With artificial intelligence and algorithms, they obviously bring a new dimension, new products and all that. Do you think that is going to disrupt your ranking? Or are you going to add maybe a new rubric The reason why I'm asking that, my research is looking at cause of ethics. And one of the criticisms that has been put across is that, the big international corporations are putting cause of ethics to avoid regulation. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. Probably, I think cause of ethics can break down international law and standards in a way that average people understand, and leading to a full realization of upholding of international standards. But my question is, do code of ethics and compliance with code of ethics count towards compliance with digital rights? Thank you very much.
So we've got the last comment or question from the second to the last row.
Me?
We can't see you, but we can.
Okay. I'm Rodriguez Katuva. I'm from Congo, DRC. And I'm very happy I could come and see and participate on this great debate. So I've seen on the telecommunication companies, I'm sorry, my English is not very, very good. My French is excellent. So I've seen that there was a Bharti Airtel, and Bharti Airtel is the main internet provider in my country, DRC. So exactly 1 week ago, there are 11 young people who was contesting, I think, before in front of office of this Airtel, Bharti Airtel, and they have been 11 young people have been really badly aggressed by policemen. They was contesting against the high price of internet and the way that since the last 4 years, people are kidnapping. There are people they kidnap and they ask for a ransom. I don't know ransom in English. What is it? You pay money for, and they are using mobile money by this Airtel, but Airtel cannot geolocate them. So their need was, Airtel, we need you to give a better internet, because in Rwanda, the prices are 10 times cheaper than in our country. Airtel, we want you to geolocate people who are kidnapping, because they are using Airtel to be paid. So they kidnap, you send money by mobile money by Airtel, but you ask Airtel, where is this guy who took this money? They can't find him. And 3 other problems. So I don't know if when you made the ranking, was you aware of that? And what should be the other way to try to have to réclamer les droits, the way to claim that can change, because it's not possible. Congo and Rwanda, they are separated by only one border, and the same internet is 10 times cheaper in my country than in Rwanda, and 10 times bad. So it means, yes, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, and please go ahead. There are a few questions in many of the comments that were made, so please go ahead. And I'll come to you.
My bad memory. The gentleman who commented about artificial intelligence, I'll start with that one. So we're actually, the next index that we're actually going to take a little bit of a break, and our next index will come out in early 2021. And we're going to spend the coming year developing new indicators, including around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithms, because it's becoming such a huge issue. And we're not looking at ethics. Ethics are kind of meaningless and relative. We're working to develop indicators around companies' disclosure and practice in deployment of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithms based on human rights standards. And so we're going to be, over the coming year, we're doing consultations with stakeholders about what needs to be in these indicators and what's most important for people like yourself. So watch our website, subscribe to our newsletter as we're putting out the draft indicators or questions for stakeholders. We want to engage with as many people as possible. So please, we hope you'll engage with us. on this, because it's vitally important. And I agree with you. Kind of ethics. What the heck is ethics? You know, it's like everybody has a different definition, but human rights standards, it's clear what you mean, and there's clarity about how you implement a commitment to freedom of expression, a commitment to privacy under human rights standards, and what constitutes violation. And that's very important. So that's one. To speak to some of the other questions, and please jog my memory, or, you know, so what does 100 look like? You can go to our website and look at all the questions of all the indicators, and that'll give you a better sense. But in aggregate, first of all, you're showing very robust oversight and due diligence about the risks of freedom of expression. You're showing robust grievance and remedy mechanisms. And when it comes to all the ways in which someone's speech or access to information might be shaped or restricted, either by third parties or by the company itself, there's clarity with users about that. And all the ways that someone might know something about what you're doing on the service or through the service, whether it's through a government demand or a hacker or, you know, whatever, or the company selling your data, that you understand how your digital life is being accessed and used. And that's conceptually what 100 looks like. Help me with some of the others. Julie, your question, I'm blanking exactly. It was a challenging. Fragmented. Yeah, and it relates to I think, another question as well in terms of, you know, how people can use the data. I mean, we do have a challenge with governments, and this, Shmyla was mentioning this as well, that you increasingly have governments that are really trying to retake their sovereignty over what many of us had hoped would be a free and open, globally interconnected environment. And that transparency isn't enough if you're just being transparent about how you're complying with horrible laws. And that's where policy advocacy becomes very important. And this relates also to the questions about using the data. The data shows that some companies are doing poorly, in part because the governments are causing them to do poorly, because they're not able to respect human rights. And so there's, I think, a real need. Obviously, you know, we're looking at the company side. There are other organizations that are ranking governments, and, you know, you can put that together. That's vitally important. And there are areas where companies can actually use the data and say, look, you government, you're making me do badly on this. And where civil society and companies can actually join together using some of this information to push for policy change, where companies say, I'd like to be more transparent, but this government's preventing me from doing so, and maybe find common cause with the citizens who would like to see that transparency, and there's no legitimate national security reason. And the gentleman who was talking about Bharti, you know, and in your country, yeah, I mean, this is certainly a company that has scored quite low in terms of due diligence. They're not publishing transparency reports that relate to how other governments are demanding censorship or takedowns or handing over user data. They're showing little evidence of any kind of commitment or due diligence in their global operations. And so it would be good to see civil society in countries where companies like Bharti operate to really kind of shine a light on their lack of transparency or commitment on these things. You know, so there could be a longer conversation as well about companies that are contributing to crackdowns on human rights defenders and how that needs to change as well, which is out of the scope of the index, but obviously important. And one last thing, Julie mentioned the Google and Dragonfly. I mean, we look at specific services of Google for the most part, but we also look at their overall human rights due diligence and governance and oversight. And as you'll see from Google's governance score, it's on the lower side among G&I companies. And so you can you draw a direct line between the Dragonfly situation and their governance around human rights impacts being a bit lower than other G&I companies? That's something to explore.
Thank you, Rebecca. So, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but with your kind permission, I'm just going to ask Shmyla and Afef to, spend a minute each if there are any questions that you felt, haven't been answered. And the good news, by the way, is that this conversation continues over dinner anyway, so there's enough time to continue part of this conversation. So,
just to speak to sort of how advocacy, I think, and whether this can be translated into actual sort of action and policies. I think the progress sort of comes from when we take these indicators and as civil society we translate them into sort of Afef said, sort of lived experiences and also part of the popular vocabulary. We've seen with privacy, it has become part of sort of the mainstream sort of issues that we care about, and that has had a real impact as well. And it's something that I wanted to also comment on, sort of the idea that privacy is a concept that maybe doesn't apply to all sort of cultures or traditions. I think it's sometimes flagged as such, sort of sometimes distinctions are drawn between communal cultures and more individual cultures, but privacy is a value that affords protection and is closely guarded in all contexts as well, coming from what might be considered as a more sort of collective culture. It still sort of, for example, I can speak for women closely guard their privacy because it's also closely tied to security. And we've seen that these sort of, obviously we're talking about big tech companies, but data leaks from, for example, telcos regarding somebody's number or their identity information. Actually, we've seen a really direct line between that and harassment cases on the ground. So it also has a really tangible impact in the sense. So these are not just sort of corporate accountability, sort of corporate governance issues. They also tie back to values that people really care about. And I think once we sort of distill those sort of these numbers in that sense, I think we can probably ground the issues of privacy and freedom of expression and things like that.
I actually wanted to comment on Julie's comment or question regarding the companies having sort of adopting different practices in Europe where there are stronger protections for human rights than in other countries. It's also something I'm noticing a lot in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I have a lot of questions. At this point, I have more questions than answers. Regarding content moderation, for instance. You see it on Twitter, this government trolls from Saudi Arabia abusing political activists or human rights activists, not only that are Saudis, but of other nationalities, and threatening them. And then you see those tweets stay there for hours and days and weeks, and Twitter not doing anything about it. And then Twitter deciding to silence Wael Abbas, for instance, who's a prominent human rights activist. So it raises a lot of questions, are they investing enough resources in Arabic language moderators? Are they training these Arabic language moderators on human rights standards? It's one big question that but it's also so many other questions that I have, and I think there is a need for more campaigning from our part to sort of on these issues, because the governments are not going to be doing much. Actually, the governments are probably want to pressure these companies to actually take their side. And companies like Twitter and Facebook, they have offices in the UAE, which is another big question. This is one of the most repressive country, one of the most repressive countries in the region. So that's also it raises serious questions about whether these two companies, they have assessed the risks that comes with opening an office there. And increasingly, you look at the Twitter transparency report, increasingly the UAE government is making more and more requests for censorship, but also for user data. Twitter is not, responding to all of them. Like they are not providing like, but it raises question like about the future. If the pressure is going to be up, what does it mean? And also, I mean, with the politics in the region is more complicated. So it's like more of, it's not only the UAE. Like decisions that are taken by the UAE government or like attempts to censor from the UAE government may not only impact activists in the UAE, but it could also, impact other activists because it's with the politics, the regional politics is complicated. So there are like allies, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and, Egypt. They have strong, how do I say it? They're like strong allies, but like, in their alliance is targeting, also human rights activists and vulnerable communities. Okay, and I'm done.
Thank you, Afef. Thank you, Shmyla, and thank you, Rebecca. And thank you. It's called the After Hours session for a reason. It's been a long day, but you were still here. So the conversation continues, over dinner, and also when we leave here, ranking rights is the hashtag. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.